What are absolute units in CSS, and when should you use them? As you design your pages, you will work with different properties like widths, heights, padding, margins, and more. When you define these properties, you will need to specify the length units of measurement you want to use. There are two types of units you can use to define these properties: relative units and absolute units. In this lecture, we will just focus on absolute units. Absolute length units are of fixed length and are not relative to anything else. Relative means that the length is relative to something else, like the size of the screen or the size of the parent element. We will talk more about relative units in the next few videos. The most common absolute unit is the pixel, px. Pixels are fixed size units of measurement in CSS, providing precise control over dimensions. This means that 1 px is always equal to 1/96th of an inch. It is important to note that while 1 px is standardized as 1/96th of an inch for the purpose of CSS layout, the actual physical size of a pixel may differ depending on the display. Let's take a look at an example of using pixels to set the width and height for a box. In this example, we have a red box with a width and height set to 100 pixels. The dimensions for this box will stay the same regardless of changes pertaining to the screen size. So, if you are on a device with a small screen, the box will still be 100 pixels wide. If you are on a large desktop screen, the box will still be 100 pixels wide. So, when should you use absolute units like pixels? Well, it depends on the situation. But generally, you will use pixels where you need precise control over element dimensions, spacing, and layout. Sometimes you might use pixels for margins, padding, and borders. Here's an example of using pixels to set the margin for a box. Remember that margin is the space outside the box. So in this example, the box will have a margin of 10 pixels on all sides. Other types of absolute units include the following: the in unit, or inches, which is equal to 96 pixels. The cm unit, or centimeters, which is equal to 25.264ths of an inch. The mm unit, or millimeters, which is equal to 1/10 of a centimeter. The q unit, or quarter millimeters, which is equal to 1/40th of a centimeter. The pc unit, or picas, which is equal to 1/6th of an inch. The pt unit, or points, which is equal to 1/72nd of an inch. Most of these units will be used for print and not for screens. While the most common unit you will use is pixels, it is important to know that the other absolute units exist. What are percentages in CSS, and when should you use them? Percentages in CSS are relative units that allow you to define sizes, dimensions, and other properties as a proportion of their parent element. When you use a percentage value, you're essentially saying, make this X% of its container. For example, if you set width 50% on an element, it will occupy half the width of its parent container. This makes percentages incredibly useful for creating responsive designs that adapt to different screen sizes. Percentages are ideal for creating fluid layouts that adjust to various screen sizes. For instance, setting a container to width 80% ensures it takes up 80% of its parent's width, regardless of the device. Using percentages for flexible images is another common practice. By applying max width 100% to images, you allow them to scale down on smaller screens while maintaining their aspect ratio. While less common, percentages can also be used for font sizes to create scalable typography. For example, font size 120% would make the text 20% larger than its parent's font size. Percentages can be particularly handy for vertical centering. Here's an example of how you might use percentages with the transform property to center an element vertically. This code positions the element 50% from the top of its container, then uses transform to move it back up by half of its own height, effectively centering it vertically. You will learn more about how absolute positioning and the transform properties work in more detail in future lecture videos. Here's the result on the screen. Remember, percentages are always relative to something. For horizontal properties like width, they're relative to the parent's width. For vertical properties like height, they're usually relative to the parent's height, if specified. However, be cautious when nesting elements with percentage-based dimensions, as this can lead to unexpected results. Also, keep in mind that percentage-based heights can be tricky if the parent doesn't have a defined height. In summary, percentages in CSS are powerful tools for creating flexible, responsive designs. Use them when you want elements to scale proportionately to their containers or when you need layouts that adapt seamlessly to different screen sizes. What are ems and rems in CSS, and when should you use them? In the previous lecture, we learned about absolute length units like pixels. While absolute units can be helpful in certain situations, there will be times when you want to use relative units. In this lecture, we will learn about two relative units, ems and rems. Em units are relative to the font size of the element. If you are using ems for the font size property, the size of the text will be relative to the font size of the parent element. To better understand how this works, let's take a look at an example. For the HTML, we have a paragraph and div element. The paragraph element has a class of para, and the div element has a class of blue dash box. Here is the accompanying CSS. For the para class, we set the font size to 20 pixels and the margin bottom to 1.5 em. This means that the margin will be 1.5 times the font size of the paragraph element. 1.5 em results in 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of the page. Is the accompanying CSS. For the para class, we set the font size to 20 pixels and the margin bottom to 1.5 em. This means that the margin will be 1.5 times the font size of the paragraph element. 1.5 em results in 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of the paragraph. We have also set a border of 2 pixels solid red so you can see the margins better. For the blue dash box class, we set the background color to blue, the text color to white, and the padding to 10 pixels on all 4 sides. This is what the example looks like in the browser. As you can see in the example, there is a clear space between the bottom of the paragraph element and the blue box. So what happens if we remove the font size property from the para class? Well, the margin bottom will be relative to the font size of the parent element. In this case, the parent element is the body element, which has a default font size of 16 pixels. Good use cases for M's would be when you are working with modular components like buttons or cards. By using M units, you can ensure that all aspects of the component, such as padding, margin, and borders, scale proportionately with the font size, keeping consistent proportions. So, up to this point, we have been setting the font size for an element using pixels. But that does present some challenges for users. Inside your browser settings, you can control the default font size. For those with visual impairments, they may increase the font size to make it easier to read. But if you are setting pixels for the font sizes in your web designs, the text will not scale proportionately with the rest of the content. One way to address this issue is to use rem units for typography. A rem unit is relative to the font size of the root element, which is the HTML element. By default, the font size of the HTML element is 16 pixels. If the user increases the font size of their browser settings, the font size of the HTML element will increase, and all rem units will scale proportionately. Here's an example of using the rem unit for the font size instead of pixels. By setting the font size to 1.2 rem, the font size of the paragraph element will be 1.2 times the font size of the root element. If the user hasn't changed the default font size of the paragraph element will be 19.2 pixels because it is 1.2 times 16 pixels. So when should you use rem units? Rem units are preferred over pixels for typography because they scale proportionately with the user's browser settings. This makes your content more accessible to users with visual impairments. Rem units can also help maintain consistent spacing and layout across different elements. What are VH and VW units and when should you use them? In CSS, VH and VW are viewport relative units that allow you to size elements based on the dimensions of the browser window. These units are particularly useful for creating responsive designs that adapt to different screen sizes. VH stands for viewport height, and 1 VH is equal to 1% of the viewport's height. Similarly, VW stands for viewport width, and 1 VW is equal to 1% of the viewport's width. This means that if you set an element's height to 100 VH, it will occupy the full height of the viewport, regardless of the actual pixel dimensions of the device. These units are especially handy when you want to create full screen layouts or elements that maintain a specific proportion of the screen. For example, you might want to use them to create a hero section that always fills the entire screen. This CSS ensures that the hero section will always be exactly the size of the viewport regardless of the device's screen size. VH and VW units can also be used for typography to create responsive text sizes. For instance, this will set the font size of H1 elements to 5% of the viewport width, allowing the text to scale smoothly with the browser window size. One of the advantages of VH and VW units is that they respond to changes in the viewport size in real time. This means that if a user resizes their browser window, elements sized with these units will adjust accordingly without needing to reload the page. However, it's important to use these units judiciously. Setting font sizes solely with VW units, for example, can lead to text becoming too small on narrow screens or too large on wide screens. Another consideration is that on mobile devices, the viewport height can change when the browser's address bar appears or disappears, which can cause unexpected layout shifts if you're using VH units extensively. In summary, VH and VW units are powerful tools for creating responsive layouts and elements that adapt to the viewport size. They're particularly useful for full-screen sections, maintaining aspect ratios, and creating smoothly scaling designs. However, they should be used thoughtfully and often in combination with other CSS techniques to ensure the best user experience across all devices. What is the calc function and how does it work? With the calc function, you can perform calculations directly within your style sheets to determine property values dynamically. This means that you can create flexible and responsive user interfaces by calculating dimensions based on the viewport size or other elements. Calc is a CSS function. You'll learn more about functions when you start learning about JavaScript, but in this lecture, you're going to learn the basics you need to know to understand how calc works. A function is a block of code that performs a specific task. Some functions are already defined in CSS, so you can use them directly and pass any necessary values to them to customize how their tasks will be performed. In the world of programming, when we run the task performed by a function, we say we call the function. The values that we pass into the function are known as arguments. Like you can see in this general example, to call a function, you write its name followed by the arguments within parentheses, separated by commas. There shouldn't be a space between the name of the function and the opening parentheses. A function may only need one value to know what to do. In that case, it will only take one argument. That's what happens with the calc function. It takes one argument because it needs to know what to calculate. For this, you pass something called an expression as an argument. An expression is a combination of values and operators that produce a result. This is how you call the calc function. You write the name calc, followed by parentheses, and within the parentheses you write the expression. The expression is evaluated to calculate the final result. Evaluated just means that the value and operators are converted into a single value behind the scenes. The result is assigned the CSS property where the calculation is being made. you can perform calculations on values that represent length, angle, time, percentages, numbers, and colors. You can also combine different units like pixels, percentages, and ems. With numbers, all the values in the expression, also called the operands, must have their corresponding units like pixels, em, and percentage. Depending on the operator, different operands may have different units. You can use the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division operators in the expression. If there are multiple operands and operators, Calc will follow the standard operator precedence rule. You can also add parentheses to establish the order of the operation if needed. Here is an example. You can see a div with the text Hello World. You can also see a CSS type selector for selecting the div. This div will have a white text and dark blue background. What's new here is that the width is calculated dynamically. Notice how we are calling the calc function and passing an expression as an argument. The expression has two operands with different units and one operator, the subtraction operator. Percentage is a relative unit. This value, 50%, will be determined by the width of the parent container. Then 20 pixels are subtracted from this value. The result of this expression will determine the width of the div. This is what you would see on a large screen. The width of the div is approximately half the total width of its container. In this case, the container takes the entire viewport width. But if you resize the parent container, the width will be recalculated automatically. That's the key advantage of using Calc. You can determine the value of a CSS property dynamically based on different aspects of the application or viewport. The expression can also contain CSS functions and variables if you need to use them in your calculations. You'll learn more about CSS variables in the next lectures. Great! Now that you know about the basics of the calc function, let's cover some of its best practices. First, you must surround the addition and subtraction operators with white space. For example, this would not be a valid expression because the subtraction operator is immediately before the second operand. The subtraction operator must be surrounded by a white space like this. Adding the white space will create a valid expression. This is not necessary for the multiplication and division operators, but it's highly recommended. You can also nest calc function calls if you need to perform calculations and use those results in other calculations. Also, if you use the value 0 to represent length in the expression that you pass into the calc function, you must include the units. For example, this expression would not be valid. You would need to add the units like px. You should also know that currently, if you use the multiplication or division operators, one of the operands has to be unitless. For the division operator, specifically the right operand has to be unitless. This would not be a valid expression because both operands have units, pixels. One of the operands, either 5 or 50, must be unitless. You would need to omit the units in one of them. Both these alternatives would be valid. And this is an example with the division operator. This would not be a valid expression since they both have units. You should remove the unit from the right operand when you have the division operator. The calc function can be very helpful for you as a web developer. With this function, you can set property values dynamically to create flexible and responsive designs.
What are pseudo-classes and how do they work? Pseudo-classes are special CSS keywords that allow you to select an element based on its specific state or position. The element state or position could include when it's active, when it's being hovered over by a mouse, when it's the first child of a parent, when it's the last child of a parent, when a link has been visited, and when it's disabled. To use a pseudo-class, you add it to the selector by using a colon followed by the name of the pseudo-class. Let's see how you can use a pseudo-class to represent each of the states and positions we already mentioned. The active pseudo-class lets you select the active state of an element, like clicking on a button. The hover pseudo-class defines the hover state of an element. An example would be hovering over a button or a link. The first child pseudo-class selects an element that is the first child of its parent. Here's an HTML example showing a div element containing multiple paragraph elements. Here's the CSS that selects the first paragraph element in that div container. The first paragraph element in that div will receive the background color and padding of 0.4 rem on all 4 sides. And here is the result in the browser. The last child pseudo-class targets the last element that is the child of its parent. Here is an example of targeting the last paragraph element in the container div element. Here is what the result looks like in the browser. The visited pseudo-class lets you style a link the user has already visited. The disabled pseudo-class lets you style an interactive element in disabled mode. As you can see, pseudo-classes let you style elements based on user interactions, like hovering or visiting a link. This makes your website feel more interactive. Apart from the pseudo-classes already mentioned, there are others, like focus, first of type, last of type, nth of type, modal, enabled, checked, required, and more. What are examples of element user action pseudo-classes? User feedback is a crucial element of web design. For instance, it's important for users to receive visual cues when they interact with elements on a website, such as hovering over a button or clicking a link. This feedback helps users understand the state of interactive elements, like indicating whether a link has been visited or not. User action pseudo-classes in CSS are special keywords that allow you to provide that kind of feedback without needing JavaScript or other programming languages. These pseudo-classes include hover, active, focus, and visited, among others. They enable you to change the appearance of elements based on user interactions, improving the overall user experience. Let's dive into some of the user action pseudo-classes we have and see how they work. The active pseudo-class applies styles when an element is activated by the user. For example, when the user clicks a button or a link, it provides immediate visual feedback, showing users that their actions are being recognized. The hover pseudo-class is triggered when a user hovers over an element with their mouse or other pointing device. Developers often use it to create visual feedback for buttons, links, or any element that should respond to user attention. Here is a button a user would hover over before clicking. Here is the CSS that changes the color, background color, and cursor of the button when the user hovers over it. Here is the original state versus the hovered state of the button. The focus pseudo-class applies styles when an element gains focus, typically through keyword navigation or when a user clicks into a form input. This is not just for feedback, but also crucial for accessibility. It ensures that users who rely heavily on keywords can easily identify which element they are interacting with. Here is an input element inside a form element. Here is the CSS that gives the input a solid dark green border and a border radius when the user clicks on it. Here is the original state versus the focus state in the browser. The visited pseudo-class targets a link the user has visited. This can be useful for helping users distinguish between pages they have already visited and the ones they are yet to visit. Here is an example of changing the anchor text color to cyan when the link is visited. Here is an unvisited link versus a visited link in the browser. The checked pseudo-class in CSS allows you to style form elements such as checkboxes and radio buttons when they are selected, checked. This pseudo-class is useful for customizing the appearance of these elements to enhance user experience, even though browsers provide default styles for them. Here's the kind of checkbox you usually check to agree to terms on a website. Here's how you can use a checked pseudo-class to indicate to the user that it is checked. In this example, we are using the appearance property set to none to remove the default styling applied by the browser to checkbox inputs. When the user checks the box, it will have the background color of red. Here is the unchecked state versus the checked state. Other examples of action pseudo-classes are focus within, for applying styles to an element when it or any of its descendants have focus, enabled for targeting form buttons or other elements that are currently enabled, disabled for targeting form buttons or other elements that are disabled, and target for applying styles to an element that is the target of a URL fragment, the part of a URL after the hash symbol. What are examples of input pseudo-classes? The appearance and behavior of input elements matter when building web forms. A form with inputs that respond to user actions goes a long way in improving user experience, and it should not cause confusion or frustration. CSS provides several input pseudo-classes that can make your forms more intuitive and user-friendly. Let's look at these pseudo-classes in detail. The focus pseudo-class allows you to target an input element when a user selects or clicks on it, drawing attention to the active input field. This helps users easily identify where they're currently typing. As the name implies, the hover pseudo-class is triggered when the user places the cursor over an element. It provides visual feedback before the user interacts with the input, effectively alerting them that the input is ready for action. In the example above, the input element background changes to an orange color when the user hovers over it, letting them know that the field is ready for interaction. The checked pseudo-class lets you style a radio button or checkbox differently when a user selects it. This way, the user can easily see which option they've chosen. Required targets input elements that have the required attribute. It signals to the user that they must fill out the field to submit the form. The HTML below has a form with 2 required input elements, and this CSS applies an orange border of 2 pixels to the 2 required inputs. Here's what the inputs look like. When validating forms, you can use the valid pseudo-class to style the input fields that meet the validation criteria, and invalid to style the input fields that do not meet the criteria. Typically, you will use green for a valid input and red for an invalid input. Here is an example using the valid pseudo-class. Here is an example using the invalid pseudo-class. Here's what they both look like in the browser. The disabled pseudo-class allows you to select and style input elements that are disabled. These elements have the disabled attribute, which prevents users from interacting with them. When an input is disabled, it cannot be clicked, focused, or edited. Here is an example of a label and a disabled input element. In the CSS, we are targeting that disabled input and giving it a background color of light gray, and changing the cursor pointer to not allowed. The cursor not allowed CSS property value changes the appearance of the cursor to indicate that an action is not permitted. When applied to an element, it shows a cursor with a circle/symbol, usually a circle with a diagonal line through it, to signal to users that the element is not interactive or cannot be clicked or interacted with. Here is what the result will look like in the browser. Here are some examples of input pseudo-classes and what they do. Autofill applies styles to input fields that the browser automatically fills with saved data. Optional styles input elements that are not required and can be left empty. In range and out of range, style elements based on whether their values are within or outside specified range constraints. What are examples of location pseudo-classes? Location pseudo-classes are used for styling links and elements that are targeted within the current document. Location pseudo-classes offer a way to apply styles based on whether a link is visited or whether an element is currently in focus. Examples of location pseudo-classes are link, visited, any link, local link, target, and target within. Let's take a deeper look at each of these pseudo-classes. The link pseudo-class allows you to target all unvisited links on a web page. You can use it to style links differently before the user clicks on them. For example, you might want to make all unvisited links blue or your website's primary color. In this case, any link the user hasn't clicked yet will appear magenta. Once the user clicks the link style no longer applies, and the visited pseudo-class takes over. The visited pseudo-class comes into play after the user clicks on it, so you can use it to target links the user has already clicked. Here is an example of changing the visited link state to the color purple. The visited pseudo-class helps users distinguish between links that they have visited and those they have not. The AnyLink pseudo-class is a combination of the link and visited pseudo-classes, so it matches any anchor element with an href attribute, regardless of whether it's visited or not. Here is an example of changing the link color for the AnyLink pseudo-class to crimson. The local link pseudo-class targets links that point to the same document. It can be useful when you want to differentiate internal links from external ones. Currently, no browser supports the local link pseudo-class. The target pseudo-class selects an element that matches the current URL fragment identifier. For example, hash symbols followed by section 1. It's very useful for pages with in-page navigation. Here is an HTML example that represents an in-page navigation. Here is the CSS that uses the target pseudo-class to style the section that matches where the user navigates to. Here is the result in the browser. When the user clicks on one of the navigation links, the background color for that respective section will change to green. What are examples of tree structural pseudo-classes? Tree structural pseudo-classes allow you to target and style elements based on their position within the document tree. The document tree refers to base trees. What are examples of tree structural pseudo-classes? Tree structural pseudo-classes allow you to target and style elements based on their position within the document tree. The document tree refers to the hierarchical structure of elements in an HTML document. Here is a list of tree structural pseudo-classes: root, empty, nth child, nth last child, first child, last child, only child, nth of type, first of type, last of type, only of type. Let's take a closer look at each one of the tree structural pseudo-classes, accompanied by examples. The root pseudo-class is usually the root HTML element. It helps you target the highest level in the document, so you can apply a common style to the entire document. The root pseudo-class is also commonly used in setting CSS variables. With CSS variables, you get to store values and reuse them in your style sheet. You will learn more about these later on. Empty elements, that is, elements with no children other than white space, are also included in the document tree. That's why there's an empty pseudo-class to target empty elements. For example, this HTML code has 2 empty list items. With the empty pseudo-class, you can style the empty list items differently. Here is the result in the browser. The most practical thing to do with the empty list items is probably not displaying them at all. Nth child allows you to select elements based on their position within a parent, while nth last child enables you to select elements by counting from the end. The n can be a specific number or a keyword like odd or even. This is incredibly useful in styling table cells based on position, even and odd. Here is an HTML example of a fruit price list table. Here is the CSS using the nth child pseudo-class to target the table cells based on odd and even positions. And this is the result in the browser. The first child and last child and only child pseudo-classes all act on items within a parent container or the entire document. First child selects the first element in a parent element or the document. Last child selects the last element in a parent element or the document. Only child selects the only element in a parent element or the document. Using the first child and last child pseudo-classes, we'll select both item 1 and item 3 in this HTML. Here is the CSS. If you have more unordered lists on the page, you have to be more specific with the selection. And here is the result in the browser. To show you how the only child pseudo-class works, here is an HTML example with 2 separate div elements. Using the only child pseudo-class ensures only the div element with a single child is selected. Here is what things look like in the browser. The first of type and last of type pseudo-classes select the first and last occurrence of a specific element type within its parent. They are useful for applying unique styles to the first and last instance of that element type among its siblings. In the HTML below, first of type and last of type applies to the first element and last element within the section element. Here's the CSS. Nth of type allows you to select a specific element within its parent based on its position among siblings of the same type. For instance, in the HTML, nth of type 2 targets the second element in the container. Here is the CSS. Here is the result in the browser. Only of type selects an element if it's the only one of its type within its parent. This can be useful for emphasizing single items or ensuring that they are styled differently when they're not part of a group. In the HTML, there are 2 div elements with one having a single element. Here's the CSS that only applies to the first container. And here is the result in the browser. What are examples of functional pseudo-classes? Functional pseudo-classes allow you to select elements based on more complex conditions or relationships. Unlike regular pseudo-classes, which target elements based on a state, for example hover or focus, functional pseudo-classes accept arguments within parentheses, hence the name functional pseudo-classes. Examples of functional pseudo-classes are is, where, has, and not. Let's take a deeper look at each of these functional pseudo-classes with examples. The is pseudo-class is useful when you want to style a group of elements that share some, but not all, characteristics. For example, you might want to style different types of buttons on your website, including button elements, links styled as buttons, and input elements with types submit and reset. Here is an HTML example representing that. Without the is function, you would have to write a complex selector like this one. With the is function, you can write a more compact and understandable selector like this. This is the result in the browser. The where pseudo-class functions similarly to is, but it doesn't increase the specificity of your selectors. This makes it ideal for applying styles without affecting the specificity of other rules. For example, you can use the where function to apply zero margin and padding to heading elements. This ensures that the reset won't interfere with more specific styles you might apply later. Here is the HTML for that. And this is the CSS. Here's what that looks like in the browser. Styling a parent element based on its children's state was previously challenging until the has pseudo-class was introduced. It allows you to apply styles to a parent element based on the presence or state of its child elements. For example, the CSS will only apply to any article element that has an h2 inside it. Here is the HTML for that. Here's what things look like in the browser. The not pseudo-class is ideal for situations where you want to apply styles to a group of elements, excluding one or more specific exceptions. In the CSS, any button that is not a primary button will have a gray background. Here is the HTML for the buttons. And here's the output in the browser. What are pseudo-elements and how do they work? One of the most interesting aspects of CSS is the use of pseudo-elements. In this context, pseudo means not real. So pseudo-elements are virtual or synthetic elements that don't directly match any actual HTML elements. They allow you to style specific parts of an element or insert content without adding extra HTML. To apply a pseudo-element, attach it to the original element's selector using a double colon. Note that the selector can be any type, such as a class or ID selector. Here's what the basic syntax of pseudo-elements looks like. This double colon is what distinguishes pseudo-elements from pseudo-classes, which use a single colon. Pseudo-elements allow you to style specific parts of an element's content or insert content before or after it. but they cannot exist independently. The element to which a pseudo-element is attached is called its originating element. Let's start by looking at examples for the before and after pseudo-elements. As their name suggests, before lets you insert content just before the element's content, while after lets you insert content after it. Here is an example of a button element. In the CSS, we will use absolute positioning and the before pseudo-element to add a star before the button's Learn More text. You will learn more about absolute positioning in future videos. The content property is used to represent the content you wish to add before the button text. In this example, we're adding a star. Here's what things look like in the browser. You'll notice that you can not only insert content, but also style it. Here is an example of the after pseudo-element with the same button. In the after pseudo-element, the transition property is used to animate changes over 0.3 seconds with an easing effect, creating a smooth and gradual transformation rather than a sudden one. You will learn more about the transition property in future videos. Here's what the button looks like in the browser. You can also attach a pseudo-class to the content you insert into another content with the before and after pseudo-elements. For example, a hover state for the content. Here is an example. With transform translate x 2 pixels in the hover state, the content gets pushed to the right by 2 pixels anytime the user hovers on the button. The transition property in the after itself ensures the process takes 0.3 seconds. That's what the transform property does. It allows you to rotate, skew, scale, or translate an element in a particular direction. You will learn more about that in future videos. And here is the result in the browser. How cool is that? The next example we will look at deals with the first letter pseudo-element. The first letter pseudo-element targets the first letter of an element's content, allowing you to style it. Here is an example of some paragraph text. If we want to style the first letter, we can use the first letter pseudo-element like this. Here is what the result looks like in the browser. The last example we will look at is the marker pseudo-element. The marker pseudo-element lets you select the marker, bullet or numbering of list items for styling. The marker pseudo-element offers a way to enhance your website's brand identity by customizing list markers to match your color scheme. Here is an example of an unordered list and an ordered list. To change the list item's marker color and size, you can use the marker pseudo-element like this. Here's what the result looks like in the browser. Here's what the result looks like in the browser. In this lecture video, we covered only a few pseudo-elements, but there are many more, like placeholder, spelling error, and selection, that I encourage you to explore on your own.
is the Lord of the universe.